Good morning, all of you. My name is Bhatia, and this is the class of BHIE 145. And now, in this class, we will cover our unit 10. As you all know, that in our earlier class, we have discussed about unit 9, Germany, France, Italy, unification of Germany, unification of Italy. We have done a lot of things related to that. Now, in this unit 10, we are going to discuss about the liberal democracy, how liberal democracy existed in Europe at that time, in unit 10. And unit 9, that was very important for all of you, then you should discuss about that. I have discussed. If you were to study and compare the Europe of between the two periods, fundamental changes, because if we are going to discuss about the democracy, then we need to discuss about the fundamental rights and fundamental changes that existed in that area. This was so because the First World War, that is the First World War, the time period of First World War was for 1914 to 1918, First World War, and the subsequent developments in the field of economy and diplomatic relations transferred the Europe of 20th century beyond recognition. Diplomatic relations and the economy that was transferred to the Europe of 20th century beyond recognition. This unit discusses the nature of changes that occurred in Europe, means how much changes that existed at that time, at the time of First World War, at the time of Second World War, how economy existed at that time in 1920s, and their impact on the history of subsequent period. That time, the First World War and the economic changes and the fundamental changes, how they occurred at that time. We are going to discuss in this unit about this. In particular, it focused function in Britain, France, and Germany. We have discussed about industrial revolution, industrialism in Britain, and after Britain, Germany, after Germany, France, how it occurred, industrialism. And after industrialism, we have discussed about the how democracy came into the Europe, and after democracy came into Europe, and we are going to discuss about the liberal democracy, because these type two words were existed over there, liberals and radicals. We have discussed about radicals in our earlier unit 8, unit 9, and now liberal democratic regimes. The historians and critic Eric Hobsbawm once referred to the period 1914 to 1945. This is the time period when First World War and the Second World War occurred in the Europe, in the here, as the 30 Years War. This time period is known as the war period, and Hobsbawm was speaking of the unresolved crisis of Europe after the First World War, unresolved crisis. That's why resulting in the catastrophe of fascism and the World War II. Fascism, Nazism. Have you heard about these two words? Fascism and Nazism. These were the parties related to Germany and Italy. The interwar period may be seen as attempt by various regimes to overcome the crisis, with various solutions being posed ranging from radical revolutions on the left and fascism on the right. Fascism on the right side and radical revolutions on the left side. The major liberal democratic experiment was the Weimar Republic in Germany. That is very important for all of you. Weimar Republic in Germany. Major liberal democratic experiment that born out of Germany's defeat in First World War. In World War One, Germany was defeated at that time, and the Weimar Republic was Germany's first attempt at liberal democracy with a broad adult suffrage. Versailles and after. The Treaty of Versailles, you have heard about this or not? Treaty of Versailles after World War One. The Versailles Conference was the conference of the victorious Allied powers to extract the terms of defeat from Germany. The conference was dominated by three major actors: President Woodrow Wilson of US, George Clemenceau of France, and Lord George of Britain. These were the three actors who played very important role in the Treaty of Versailles after First World War. The real debate was between Wilson's liberal vision over the post-war settlement and Clemenceau's nationalist insistence on extracting harsh terms from Germany. The Clemenceau was obsessed with what he saw as France's security needs. Given that France, as a mainland power, had suffered the most from the war, hence the need to break Germany's might once and for all. On the other hand, Wilson's vision was a broader one. His 14 points stressed the ideals of self-determination, sovereignty, and justice. Wilson's idea was to provide for a new program stability for the modern state system, which had been put into place by the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century. Woodrow Wilson had given 14 rules, 14 points, and that stressed the ideals of self-determination, sovereignty, and justice. Woodrow Wilson. This stability had been destroyed beginning with the intra-European rivalry in the 19th century, culminating in World War I. The American historian Charles Maras spoken of how the ideals of Wilson and those of Russian revolutionary leader Lenin, who was obviously not at Versailles, that offer different yet new ways of perceiving the modern state system. They wanted to give a new ways in perceiving the modern state system. That's why, while Wilson's was a liberal program speaking of a new world order, world government, Lenin's was a radical cry to overturn the old state system through world revolution, that is, the League of Nations. What is the Weimar Republic and what is the liberal democracy? Here we are going to discuss in this point the Weimar Republic and liberal democracy. The Weimar Republic refers to the political system that came into place in Germany after World War One and continued till the Nazi takeover in 1933. The name comes from the town of Weimar in Germany, where Republic's constitution was promulgated. The Republic was born in the background of defeat and attempts by revolutionary socialists to emulate the example of Bolsheviks in Russia. The early days of Weimar were marred by the brutal murder of noted revolutionary socialists Rosa Luxemburg, the threat from liberal democracy, revolutionary socialism, which became the Communist Party, was to be a constant feature of Weimar period till the rise of the Nazis. The very fact that the Republic was established on the principle of universal suffrage, formal political freedom, and democratic parliament was an important step in European history. These 3 points means the principle of universal suffrage, formal political freedom, democratic parliament. That was an important step in European history. The old electoral clause, which prevented the reformist Social Democrats from expansion, were not now removed, giving the party an important voice. Which party? Nazism. New law on individual freedoms and social policy were enacted in Weimar largely under social democratic influence. Stresemann project was to unite the various fractions of German elite under the Weimar banner, while fighting off the more radical challenges from the communists and the Nazis. What was the social struggle and what was the search for stability they were facing at that time? Apart from Weimar Republic of Germany, France, Britain were the other two important democratic regimes. After Germany, France and Britain. There were many similarities between the two regimes, but they were also different in some ways. Britain had been an economic superpower but had lost its superior economic status by the beginning of 20th century. France, on the other hand, had managed to retain economic prosperity in the post-war period. Economic prosperity. Now, next is Britain. The post-war position of Britain, we are talking about World War One. After World War One, the position of Britain confirmed the long-term decline of British dominance in the world economy. British dominance based on the free trade imperialism of 19th century that was already in crisis towards the last decade of that century. In 1920s, Britain slowly gave way to US economically. At any rate, the British dependence on the US during the war had grown since the UK was in no position to organize the war effort by itself. However, by 1924, a minor recovery did take place in Britain, largely through the financial intervention of the state. Industries like the automobile and shipbuilding revived, and by 1925, Winston Churchill was able to restore the pound to its pre-war parity with the dollar and put Britain back on the gold standard. However, even this recovery was mixed. Industry never returned to pre-war levels, and Britain was increasingly challenged in the world market by the US, Germany, and Japan. This process of long-term decline could not but affect the political scenario. The liberals, whose politics was based on 19th century free trade doctrines, began to give way to the labor. And the new task were to incorporate the growing demands of social citizenship by the working class. This entailed a certain restructuring of the 19th century socio-economic system. What about the France? The French economic recovery after World War One was undoubtedly more substantial than that of the UK. Pre-war France was never as advanced industrially in terms of world economy. French foreign trade was limited in terms of its share in national GNP. French industrialization and modernization of agriculture had been proceeding rapidly in the late 19th century. But the steadiness of such growth meant that there were no spectacular equivalents of the Industrial Revolution in England and reconstruction of the United States. World War I did lead to the substantial rationalism in French industry to meet the demands of the war effort. This rationalism continued after the war. The return of Alsace and the Lorraine boosted the industrial potential available to France. By 1925, the index of industrial production was double that of 1919. The balance payment position seemed favorable. Yet problems remained. One of the long-term legacies of revolution was high food prices, protective agricultural policy towards the post-revolutionary peasants. What was the crisis of diplomacy? How they were facing, the people of the Europe, they were facing at that time the crisis of diplomacy. The League of Nations was Wilson's great internationalist project for the new era. The League of Nations. The League was to provide the foundation for order in the post-war scenario, to remark the international state system, which had been successfully undermined by the conflict among European powers. The League's main project was collective security. We are talking about the League of Nations. But in the European scenario, this was subject to a number of twists and turns. Different countries in Europe perceived their security needs differently. For instance, Britain perceived Soviet Russia to be the main enemy. France saw the main threat from the neighboring Germany. European scenario was complicated by a number of factors. How? The problem of Germany and the unresolved legacy of Versailles Pact, the French clamor for security in Europe, and the Russian revolutionary threat. Yes, the Russian revolutions also played a very important role in that. Both obsession with security and the German problem were linked since French intransigence often led to crisis in the reparations sought from Germany. The French agenda in the League often came to naught, with the British expressing exasperation over what they saw as French intransigence over issues of disarmament. What were the economic crises they were facing at that time? The prices of food, the prices of agriculture, and the taxation, they were increasing. How? The immediate post-war period saw the rationalization of European industry on the lines of American experiments. Ford's assembly line and horizontal integration methods, along with a new regime of labor standards, had vastly improved productivity in the United States. The success of United States was held out as a model for emulation by Europe. In fact, from Germany to Russia and the France to Italy, variants of American style reforms took place. All this was often backed up by cheap American credits, by US machinery and capital goods. Understanding the 1920s. As pointed out earlier, Karl Polanyi argued that the First World War destroyed the foundations of 19th century Europe. In every sense, the economic crisis completed this process. The crisis was the final nail in the coffin of 19th century economic liberalism based on British notions of a self-regulating world market and a free trade regime. After the crisis, the role of state began to take on a new prominence. The heart of this transformation was the reading of seminal works of the economist John Maynard Keynes, which would become a recipe for economic revival in Europe, and the US Keynes had argued that the state intervention was needed in order to stimulate demand for commodities. This we have understood about the 1920s. Now, in Unit 11, yes, just to recall Unit 9, Unit 10, we have understood about the 1920s, how economic crisis we were facing in 1920s, in 1918, 1914 to 1918. We have discussed about the economic crisis, how economic crisis were facing by the people of France, people of Italy, people of Britain, people of US, and what was the European scenario was facing by the people of Germany. The crisis of diplomacy, how they were facing the crisis in diplomacy. World War One was the turning point of that particular crisis. What was the situation and what was the condition of France at the time of post World War One? Winston Churchill, what was the role of Winston Churchill, and what was the condition of Britain at that time? Because industrial revolutions started from Britain, and at that time the industrialization had not that much benefited in Britain. Social struggle and search for stability, we have discussed about how they stable and how they faced social struggles at that time. Weimar Republic that played a very important role in democracy, and Weimar Republic and the Treaty of Versailles that were very much important. And these type of questions will come into your short note also in your exam. Treaty of Versailles, and after the Treaty of Versailles, what were the impact of Treaty of Versailles? Yes, we have discussed a lot about in France, Britain, and Germany, a lot related to democracy, liberal democracy, related to the Treaty of Versailles, and related to the Weimar Republic. That is very important for all of you. Then these type of things we have discussed in our Unit 10. That is also very important for all of you. You should learn these type of points in your for your examination. Economic crisis, how the people were facing at that time, understanding the 1920s, how they people were facing the situation which were held in 1920s after First World War, 1914 to 1918. Next, in Unit 11, we are going to discuss about the socialist world. Socialist world. After liberal democracy, how the people were facing the socialist world. In this unit, you have already read something about the socialist vision of society. The linkage that socialist parties developed with the workers' struggles in the early 20th century added a new dimension to popular struggles in Europe. New dimensions in popular struggle in Europe. Both the workers and the socialist world struggles and the activities of socialist parties. Workers and the socialist parties, they became powerful mass movements in the 20th century. How they demanding their how they demanding for themselves, for the people. Their association generated new symbols of revolution and working class power such as demonstration, general strikes, workers' theatre, the red flag, May Day as Workers' Day, 8 March as International Women's Day. That days were very important at that time, and they were facing a lot of things related to that. Though their activities were spread throughout Europe, Their greatest impact was, however, in Russia, where the radical movements assumed on overwhelmingly anti-capitalist stance and a socialist vision. The late 19th and early 20th century was marked by a succession of revolutionary waves culminating in the first socialist revolution. First socialist revolution. Why in Russia? Karl Marx, in his later years, had presently commented on the rise in revolutionary temper in late 19th century Russia. But the entire thrust of the socialist thought had been towards arguing for revolution in the countries of mature and most developed capitalism. It was envisaged that the capitalist system would be most vulnerable, where all it was most mature because its contradictions or conflicts and tensions in the form of private ownership and socialized production were starker in these centuries. What was the political structure they were facing at that time? In Western Europe, the growth of capitalism. The growth of capitalism had led to the evolution of liberal constitutionalism and parliamentary democracies. In Russia, right up to 1917, there existed an autocratic form of government ruled by Tsar. Autocratic government ruled by Tsar. All the individual, civil, and fundamental rights which the citizens of Europe took for granted, and all democratic forms of collective expression, such as the right to form organization, strikes, election, were not permitted in Russian territory and Russian speaking people. They were exempted from this. It also consisted of a number of non-racial groups and nationalities such as Ukrainians, Siberians, and Baltic states, etc. Non-Russian groups, just like and their nationalities such as Ukrainians, Siberians, and Baltic states. Peasantry and the working class. How they were demanding for themselves, how they were demanding the rights for themselves. Peasantry and working class. Traditionally, Russian agriculture was characterized by the practices of bonded labor attached to the land and the landlord. This practice, known as serfdom, was abolished in 1861, and the serf was now replaced by free and mobile peasantry. Serf means slaves. Who were slaves at that time? Peasants. How they were taking help from them for the peasants? They were taking help from the peasants and they were not paying to the serfs. Now, after 1861, when serfdom was abolished, that area, they were now replaced by free and mobile peasantry. Now, the peasants can go anywhere, they are free from other bondage. But the 1861 agrarian reforms did not resolve the agrarian question in the Tsarist empire. Even as capitalism developed in agriculture, the landed aristocracy remained dominant, means the landlords, still backward after 1861 also. Even as peasant agriculture became commercialized and there emerged a kulak, rich peasant strata. Kulak. What is the meaning of kulak? Rich peasant strata. The fundamental conflict in the countryside on the urgent question of land, rents, wages, rights over commons remained that between the landed aristocracy, which still held the major portion of land, and the peasantry as a whole. Means that time the peasants had no right on any type of lands. The land by their own and the land on which they were doing some labor work on rent. They were not having any right on the agricultural land. National self-determination. Now the people of that particular area, they were enhancing themselves for the self-determination. Freedom from national oppression in the Tsarist Empire coincided with the victory of socialist revolution. Apart from the alienation felt by the people of the Baltic region, Central Asia, Transcaucasia, and other areas as a result of politics. The socialist world and the cultural discrimination and the economic backwardness this that Tsarist economic policies entailed for these regions ensured that they remain predominantly agricultural with a strong stake in the land question. There emerged strong movements for national self-determination, demanding right for their own languages, own culture, equal opportunities, and even a separate political identity. Ideas and organization. How they formed their organization for demanding themselves. How the ideas of the scholars were spreading one area to another area. In the early 20th century, the main political tendencies were socialist revolutionaries who represented the class interest of the peasantry and looked on the peasantry as the motive force of revolution. Liberals of various hues, whose blueprint for Russia was the parliamentary democracy of Western Europe, and the Marxist or Social Democrats, whose inspiration and strategy derived from Marx's Communist Manifesto and his critique of Gotha program. Most radical intelligentsia were, moreover, strongly influenced by Karl Marx. Marx's critique of capitalism and the experience of the 1848 revolution in Europe, in which the bourgeois had betrayed the revolution. The class means the bourgeois. They had betrayed the revolution, and the workers had been the most consistent revolutionary force. Therefore, overwhelmingly, Russia imbibed from Western Europe its most radical thought rather than liberalism in retreat. The stages of revolution: 1917 Russian Revolution, 1848 French Revolution. The stages of revolution. The Russian Revolution may be said to have gone through three distinct stages and took almost 12 years to complete. The first stage led to the creation of a parliament called the Duma. Second stage, known as February Revolution in 1917, led to the establishment of provisional government at the center through the rule of the Tsar still prevailed. Tsar is also prevailed at that time, and they have formed provisional government in February 1917. Finally, the revolution completed its third and final stage in October 1917, when the rule of the Tsar was overthrown and People's Republic was established. That is the final thing they were facing at that time, at the time of completion of Russian Revolution in October 1917. Tsar was overthrown and the People's Republic was established. Building socialism. Building socialism in the country of revolution was in many ways as heroic a struggle as making revolution was. There was no model of an actually existing socialist society for the Bolsheviks to model their experiments on. Neither did there exist a detailed the blueprint of what socialism in practice entailed, comparable to Marx's analysis of capitalism. The early Russian revolutionaries had only their ideals to rely on and certain broad principles worked out for socialist thinkers. Russia was still backward in terms of economic development as compared to other European countries. And it was not so easy to chalk out a strategy of economic growth that would outpace capitalist economy. Besides, socialist Russia had to face the united assault of the capitalist countries, hostile and in actual war against the new state and civil war from former landlords and capitalists within Russia. New Economic Policy (NEP) that was a response NEP was a response to a political and economic crisis, even though as its core was economic changes that marked a change in the strategy of transition to socialism. In 1924, the tax in kind was replaced by a money tax, followed by legalization of private land, private trade. In 1925, the restrictions of on leasing the land and hiring of labor were eased and the agriculture tax further reduced. That is the policy of NEP. The decisive change that brought this about began in March 1921. Grain requisition was replaced by a fixed tax on income to be paid in kind, and what was much lower than the requisition targets. The peasants could keep for themselves and they trade privately and whatever else surplus that remained with them. Planning and industrialization, how they planned and how they enhanced the industrialization. The idea of a long term plan of 10 to 15 years dates from 1920, annual plan forecast were drawn up as a control figure from 1925. From 1926, various draft or prospective 5-year plans were made both for the State Planning Commission and by the Supreme Council of National Economy. This had a dual significance. It marked the beginning of a commitment to industrialization and state direction of that development through a comprehensive plan. The first 5-year plan in Europe to 1929 to 1933. The first 5-year plan focused on iron and steel, but tractor plants also had high priority. The machine tool industry was rapidly expanded in order to free the country from dependence on machinery imports from abroad. Planned targets were usually set in terms of volumes of production or quantitatively. The plan gave only the vaguest indication of where the real material resources for increased production were to come from. The second 5-year plan, the third 5-year plan, collectivization of agriculture, the weakness of NEP agriculture. Second 5-year plan, 1933 to 1937. This plan envisaged a large increase in the output of an investment in consumers' goods rather than producers' goods. Urban real wages were expected to double as a result of an increase in the money wages. and simultaneous fall in retail prices. New industrial enterprises built during the second plan mean that by 1937, more than 80% of all industrial products were manufactured in new or entirely reconstructed enterprises. In the third five-year plan, 1938 to 1941, when the Germans invade the USSR, they covers 3.5 years of the third five-year plan. 1938, 39, 40, 41. 3.5. The plan was interrupted by Second World War in June 1941 and it never completed. The collectivization of agriculture, how they collective their agriculture. The previous section on industrialization has depicted the successful effort of the Soviet leadership to rapidly transform the country into an advanced industrial economy. Industrialization, however, could not have succeeded without major changes in agriculture. While the state had succeeded in extended and consolidated control over the greater part of industry by nationalization, the predominance of private peasant farms mean that the production and marketing decisions in agriculture remain beyond central planning and therefore state control. The weakness of NEP agriculture. Peasant farming method technology under NDP had remained extremely backward. In 1927, 88% of all arable land was in small peasant holdings, and less than 5% of farms were whole or partly enclosed. The small size and fragmentation of farms prevented modern farming methods and the use of better implements. Three-field rotation system predominated with an autumn sown rye or wheat, spring sown wheat or other grain, followed by fallow. Even more primitive two-field or shifting system of cultivation were found in many areas. Grain harvest and marketing. Grain harvest, how they harvest their grain. Although grain production had recovered to pre-war levels by the mid-1920s, much less grain was marketed in 1920s than before the First World War. This was partly a consequence of increase in rural population, while this was a 6 million higher in 1926 and then in 1913 per capita grain was 16%, lower than that had been in 1930. The real problem was that there was more than one market for the sale of agriculture. The Socialist World War products. The procurement crisis of 1927 to 1928. Despite a good harvest, the autumn of 1927, peasant marketing and state procurement of grain fell far below expectation to a level that was insufficient to feed the towns and the army and exports grain in order to pay for the import of machinery. If the state has chosen to raise its procurement prices for grain to match private market prices, funds available for industrial expansion would have suffered. Peasant resistance to collectivization. The peasants met forced collectivization with large-scale passive resistance and sporadic armed resistance. Active peasant resistance to the regime and its representatives took the form of mass demonstrations involving thousands as well as terrorist acts. A term that covered murders, beating up, and arson. By the large, however, peasant protest was local and vocal rather than semi-military. PUDs. What was the terror of peasants? And what were the terrors and how they were threatening by the people? The regress of collectivization and industrialization were followed not by any period of improvement in the lives of Soviet population, but by the renewal of revolution from above, culminating in the reign of terror. This was directly not against peasants, survivors of capitalism, but in successive waves of arrest, trials, purges against industrial workers, the Communist Party, and finally the secret police itself, the executors of purges of and the terror. Historians have identified at least three political needs Stalin nursed in 1930s. Three political needs Stalin nursed. What was that? The first was to overcome opposition, criticism of his policy within the Communist Party. These were the political needs of the people, three political needs of the people at that time. How they overcome opposition and how they overcome from criticism and how their policies within the community party, Communist Party was overcome at that time. Resistance was evidently most stubborn on the part of richer peasants. But it is clear that every section of peasantry was affected and participated in the resistance to collectivization. We have discussed about Unit 10 and Unit 11. In our next class, we will discuss about Unit 12 and Unit 13 about the European history. Thank you. Have a nice day.